The propaganda war against the Axis made Orwell attentive to grievances in Arab and Muslim opinion, mainly in India, which German and Japanese radios sought to exploit. When later in the year, the British and American governments began to highlight in their propaganda the mass murder of European Jewry, this was around November 1942, and this was reflected in Orwell's broadcast too. Orwell told the Journalist College that it was important the Allies should not only underline the persecution of the Jews in Europe, but also any proposed relief schemes that could forestall the Axis claims that these measures will, quote, include some sort of Jewish invasion of Palestine and other countries. There was also an intensive propaganda war between Zionists and their opponents on the fate of Palestine, and towards the end of the war, Orwell related to it for the first time. This was in a review of the book Palestine, Land of Promise by Professor Walter Clay Loudermilk, a Zionist bestseller published in Britain in 1944 by Victor Galantz and reprinted 6 times in the next 2 years. Loudermilk, a pro-Zionist Christian American soil conservationist with an international reputation, proposed a large-scale irrigation scheme to support 4 million more people on the ground in Palestine. This meant that large-scale Jewish immigration would not be at the expense of the Arabs, as the opponents of the Zionism claimed. In addition, Loudermilk powerfully propagated the long-held Zionist argument that its endeavors in Palestine countered previous Arab neglect of the land and could modernize and improve the lives of all of its inhabitants, Jews and Arabs. Orwell agreed that the book was a well-documented account of what the Zionist settlers had already achieved in Palestine, including, quote, some impressive photographs of dense forests and populous cities in places which were desert only 20 years ago. However, as someone who had never been to Palestine himself and was wary of propaganda, Orwell added a note of caution. Loudermilk was a warm supporter of Zionism, and therefore his book had to be read with a proviso that there was also an Arab viewpoint. Quote, and, owing to the fact that the Arabs have little footing in the press outside their own country, it seldom gets a hearing. Orwell observed that the dire predicament of the Jews during the war meant that on Palestine, quote, it was de rigueur among enlightened people to accept the Jewish case as proved and avoid examining the claims of the Arabs. Writing this for an American Jewish journal, Orwell noted that such support for Zionism, quote, might be correct on its own merits, end quote, but he pointed out that it was, quote, adopted primarily because the Jews were in trouble and it was felt that one should not criticize them. In one of his essay letters to the American journal Partisan Review in the summer of 1945, Orwell repeated his view that the Labour Party and the left generally is very strongly committed to the support of the Jews against the Arabs, and he argued that this support came, quote, largely because it is only the Jewish case that ever gets a hearing in England, end quote. Orwell, however, was confusing his own surroundings in the British left with Britain as a whole. Despite a curious remark Orwell was reported as saying at a Tribune editorial meeting, that the Zionists were a bunch of Water Street Jews who have a controlling influence over the British press, the highbrow conservative press and the mass-selling Tory tabloids provided their readers constantly in these years with pro-Arab and anti-Zionist arguments which suited British policy in the Middle East. It was only among the Labour left intelligentsia that Zionism took such a primary hold. In those circles, the Nazi final solution of the genocide of European Jewry during the war forcefully engendered support for Jewish immigration into Palestine and underlined Zionist arguments for a Jewish state. Yet the Labour government voted into power in 1945, despite earlier promises to the Zionists, continued previous British foreign policy in the Middle East. This viewed large-scale Jewish immigration to Palestine as a destabilizing threat to the British position in the predominantly Arab Middle East. During the next few years, the intellectuals of the Labour left, many of them Jewish, would cry bitterly against the policy of their own government, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. The government was accused of preferring British imperial interests over the moral choice of providing justice to the Zionist aspirations of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, determined to leave the European scene of the mass murder of their families and communities. Orwell maintained that reaction to the plight of the Jewish refugees varied according to class background. It was only the middle-class supporters of the Labour Party, those who cared much about the struggle against fascism before the war, who were now concerned about Palestine, and quote, the workers, insofar as they bother about the matter at all, are not anti-Bevin on the Palestine issue, whereas nearly all left-wing intellectuals are violently so. Orwell did not share this passion on the Labour left. He took a mostly independent course on Palestine, despite the fact that some of his closest friends and political allies, such as Arthur Koestler, were pro-Zionist Jews. During a countryside holiday at Christmas 1945, Orwell and Koestler went on a walk and began to argue about Palestine. Koestler recalled that Orwell declared himself to be immovably opposed to Jewish immigration and entirely on the side of the Arabs. The two decided to leave the subject so as not to endanger their friendship. Orwell's position on the Palestine question was essentially close from the beginning to the foreign policy of Ernest Bevin and the Labour government. This argued that the right solution for the Jewish refugees was to rebuild their lives in Europe. In his Tribune column, Orwell typically took the idea a step further by suggesting that allowing 100,000 Jewish refugees to settle in Britain itself would also boost the British economy chronically short of labour. His rejection of the nationalist Zionist solution to the Jewish predicament seems to have been augmented by the anti-colonialist feelings which underlay his political thinking since his days in Burma. Orwell agreed with the Labour government's argument that unreserved support for the Zionist demands would cause repercussion in the Arab and Muslim world, including in India. However, unlike the Labour left, which presented his policy as an immoral going to imperial interests, Orwell viewed this as an acceptance of the reality that coloured people almost everywhere are pro-Arab. Elsewhere he wrote, few English people realise that the Palestine issue is partly a colour issue, and that an Indian nationalist, for instance, would probably side with Arabs. He never stated fully and clearly in his writings whether this was his own personal view, but certainly Tosco Fiver, his successor as Tribune's literary editor, and another pro-Zionist Jewish colleague and friend, believed that a large part of Orwell's dislike for Zionism was a product of his strong anti-colonial emotions. To Orwell, says Fivel, the Palestine Arabs were Asians and so victims, the Jews were white, technically advanced, and so imperialists and oppressors, end quote. Orwell's hostility to Zionism in the last years of the British Mandate perhaps also sprang from his own sense of patriotism and dislike for national movements which attacked Britain or England. After the war, the Zionist movement led an increasingly vituperative political campaign against the British government for closing Palestine to Jewish immigration. The most extreme expressions of the anti-British campaign run by the Zionist movement in many countries were in the United States, where some of the most passionate attacks on Britain were made by American liberals and left-wingers who viewed British policy in Palestine as part of an imperialist plot carried out in India, Greece, and Indonesia. In Notes on Nationalism, Orwell commented that the American variant of Zionism seems to be more malignant and violent than the British. In April 1949, after the British had left Palestine and the State of Israel was established, Orwell still believed that the Zionist Jews everywhere hate and regard Britain as the enemy, more even than Nazi Germany.